Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to it. Welcome back to your flipped classroom and our continuing discussion of the Protestant Reformation, right? So we're going to go ahead and clip in a flip that I used this year just to kind of describe some of the early reformers and stuff like that. I did a really good job describing it, so I'd really like to use that again. But I'll be right back here in about 2 seconds, right after I finish up that little stuff, to start talking about somebody else that's very important that you've already learned about in Mr. Matern's class. Stuff. Now, you'd think at one point or another that they would probably inspire some early reformers, right? And that's the thing that you need to understand, is the Protestant Reformation had started long before Martin Luther ever really got the reins of it. We just consider Martin Luther to be like the stick of dynamite that, boom, blew up the entirety of the church infrastructure in general and led to the establishment of these new churches, right? But there were people that came long before him, hundreds of years before him actually, that tried to fix the church in many different ways, but their attempts just failed, right? And so that's why they're attempts, right? So the thing about it, for example, is you got this one guy named John Wycliffe, a he was middle-aged when he actually wrote this stuff down, but John Wycliffe was an English priest, right? He was an English priest that came out with a criticism of the church during the 1300s, and he believed that the church should give up all of its earthly possessions. He actually strictly abided by the Benedictine code, and he was just like, look, the church has grown too fabulously wealthy, right? It's gotten way too rich, way over the top, way grandiose, way too much. They've gained too much power and things like that. And what's going to happen is John Wycliffe is these writings of him saying that the church should give up all of its earthly possessions and commit to poverty, like St. Benedict said. They don't get discovered until after he's already dead, right? And when he's dead, he's excommunicated after he's already dead. And then they dug up his dead body and burned it and threw it in the woods, right? Because he said that the church should give up its wealth, right? Now, this sounds a little bit sketchy, but he's one of the earliest reformers to come along. And like I said, his body was dug up and burned out of spite. Now, another one that was technically the very first successful Protestant reformer, because he started the very first Protestant church long before Luther ever did, was another guy named Jan Hus, right? And Jan Hus was a Bohemian, which in the modern day era is Czech, right? Like Czech Republic, like in the Czech Republic, that's where he's from. He's the very first big reformer. He's a priest that spoke out against the immorality of the church. He said that the church had been led astray by too many corrupt leaders, too many bad leaders, and too many politicians. And he basically said in a nutshell, we need to start talking about how messed up and how far away from the faith we've gotten and how we were being led by corrupt individuals and things like that. And so he began to advocate for a lot of different things. He advocated for receiving bread and wine at Mass rather than just the bread. He said that priests should be allowed to get married, and he advocated for this in the 1200s. In the Middle Ages, he advocated for this, right? That priests should be allowed to get married, that the Bible should be translated into languages that people can actually read for themselves rather than being kept in Latin, right? Which is a very big one, right? And remember that vernacular language thing is going to become very important. He also believed that we should abolish purgatory. He was just like, the idea of purgatory is it's silly, right? The idea of purgatory being like this cleansing era, let's get rid of that, right? And let's just say more like you were more likely to go to heaven because of God's all-defining love, right? And then another one is he wanted to eliminate simony. He said that no one should be able to sell or profit off the selling of a church office. And he also wanted to stop any future crusades. He was just like, look, the crusades are ridiculous. Like, we can enter into an agreement with the Islamic, kingdoms, and we can try to, make it so we can actually all share the Holy Land together rather than fighting over it. Now, Jan Hus was also aware, though, of things that had happened to people like John Wycliffe, things that had happened to priests that came before him, things that are going to happen later on to other people like the Inquisition and stuff like that. So he actually went into hiding, and all the people that actually followed him were called Hussites, right? So write that down real quick. Hussites. They're going to follow him, and he's going to translate the Bible into Czech, and he's going to begin preaching to them. So technically, he's the very first successful Protestant reformer, okay? He calls those people the Hussites, and he actually says that those people are his followers, and he creates the very first successful church. So with that, he created the very first group of Protestants, but the thing is that they were so good about staying in hiding with him that they all kind of died out, right? And also, their leader, Jan Hus, is going to die out as well, because he's going to be summoned to this place called the Council of Constance in 1415, and he's going to try, it's the 1400s, not the 1200s. 1200s was John Wycliffe, my bad on that one. So, now look, but he's going to be summoned to the Council of Constance, right? And they write him a letter, and they tell Jan Hus, they're like, hey, man, come have a meeting with the Pope, right? Come have a meeting with the Pope, we'll talk about all your ideas, and we promise we won't hurt you. Well, what's going to happen when he gets there is he's going to be tried for heresy, he's going to be excommunicated, he's going to be put into an inquisition, he's going to be burned, at the stake. And they mock him as well when they burn him at the stake, because they make for him a paper crown that puts on top of his head as the king of these fake Christians and stuff like that. And they kill him, and they burn him alive by burning him at the stake, which I don't know if you understand how painful and awful of a death that must be, but they killed this guy because he tried to start a new type of Christianity, right? So this is another big example of like that corruption in the church and stuff like that. And also, as you can see, that there are a lot of early reformers that are moving around that aren't just Martin Luther, right? Another big prominent one is going to be this guy named Darius Erasmus. Darius Erasmus is a Flemish writer, which means he's Dutch, and he's going to be considered the father of Christian humanism, right? So he's going to take the elements of the Renaissance and he's going to mix them together with the ideas of Christianity. And he's going to begin to kind of ride on this idea of thinking that Christianity should be a guide to life, not necessarily just a checklist into heaven. One of the biggest things that Darius Erasmus wrote about that he didn't like was he didn't like the idea that the sacraments don't actually fit all individuals' lives and stuff like that. He felt that it was just you were going through this checklist and stuff like that, rather than actually proving yourself as a good human being, and that you could just easily be a bad person as long as you're hitting your checklist, you go into heaven, that it actually is not guiding you in your everyday life, right? And he also is going to be one of the very first people to come around. He's going to translate the Bible into Greek. He's going to translate it into vernacular Greek, and this is going to make a lot of people very upset. He's going to expose Catholic Church's corruption as well. He writes a book called The Praise of Folly, where he actually makes fun of Julius II, the same pope that actually paid Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel ceiling, right? The same pope that did all these different things, that went to war, that died of syphilis, that did all this different stuff. And he's going to make fun of him. And he's actually going to have a drawing in there, and it's going to say that while other people are getting into heaven, Julius is going to have to sit outside while he has a list of all the wrong things that he's done, right? So he's actively making fun of the pope that's in power at the time. An interesting thing as well is he actually met Martin Luther. Martin Luther and him knew each other in real life. And so going into it as well, though, a big thing you need to understand about Erasmus is, though, is he never stopped being Catholic, right? He never left the Catholic faith and never started a new church. But again, you've got multiple people that are pointing out the corruption that's actually going on a political level inside the church, right? Now, the thing you need to also keep understanding is that popes are going to continue to lead very wealthy lives, right? They're going to support the arts. They're going to hire artists to beautify churches. The question, though, that you need to also ask yourself is, where are they getting all this money? That this thing right here, the Sistine Chapel ceiling, cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $2 million to pay for, right? And all of that went into Michelangelo's pocket. He also then did the Last Judgment, and he was put on retainer by Pope Paul III and stuff like that. Where is the Catholic Church getting millions of dollars for one painting in one building in the Vatican? Well, the answer to that question is a lot of different things, right? First and foremost, the rising tithe, right? They're making more money off the tithe, okay? So like as trade is returning and as the Renaissance era is boosting economics, remember the tithe is 10% of your income. It's not a flat rate. And since it's 10% of your income, that means that as more people make, the more money the church makes. And so with that, the popes are actually raking in more money. They're also going to begin to charge fees for things like baptisms and marriages and confirmations and things like that, which is going to make them money as well. But one of the big kerfuffles that goes down is in the 1400s when they begin to sell indulgences. Now, let's talk about what an indulgence is, right? You probably learned about this in class with Mr. Mathern as well. An indulgence, what it's supposed to be, is a lessening of time that the soul would have to spend in purgatory, right? And as we know already, purgatory is the Catholic belief of this place where your soul goes to be atoned, right? Now, it's kind of like the waiting room for heaven, if you will, okay? Well, the thing about it is, the question is that you have to ask yourself is, do indulgences exist in the Bible? Well, actually, the thing about it is, they do, okay? Like, in the Bible, the indulgences do exist, but they're supposed to be good deeds, right? They're supposed to be good deeds, not things you hold in your hand or things written on paper. So with that, though, what the church is going to start doing is writing them on paper, and they're going to start selling them. So the church is going to go really wayward at one point when they begin to sell these indulgences or forgiveness for sins and stuff like that, and these guarantees that you'll apparently get out of heaven sooner. Well, the problem with that is that's going to be massively unfair, because it's going to basically tell rich people, live the life you want, do whatever you want, buy an indulgence, but poor people are forced to live a morally strict life because they can't afford them, right? So Martin Luther, this is going to be the thing that's going to kind of kill him in essence, and kind of really be the thing that infuriates him. Well, what ends up happening is Pope Leo X, this guy right here, who was the pope that was in power when the Reformation truly began. Now, keep in mind, this whole time before this, we've just been talking about corruption that was going on in the church at the time. But Pope Leo X, the Medici Pope, who's the best example of nepotism because he was from the wealthiest family in Italy and actually bought and paid his way through the ranks, he's going to begin to actually sell indulgences at a much higher rate. And he sends one priest in particular into Germany to actually, well, Germany doesn't exist at the time. It's the Holy Roman Empire. And his name was Johann Tetzel. He sends this priest named Johann Tetzel to go off and sell indulgences at a very high rate so he can use the money to start fixing up St. Peter's. He wants to use the money to actually make it even nicer, to gild some parts of it, make more art, and make it look even more beautiful. And St. Peter's is St. Peter's Basilica. These indulgences were not only going to get you out of purgatory, but could even pay off a family member that was there. And so they were even more expensive, right? And so the thing about it was there was even a pamphlet that circulated the Holy Roman Empire during the time that was printed on the printing press and was sent out all over the place. And the last line of it right here says a very famous line. And jot this down real quick. When a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, right? And so the idea was even publicized by Johann Tetzel that if you give him money, then not only you will get out of purgatory sooner, but also your dead relatives will, right? That's right, and we're back. Oh, welcome back, guys. Yes. Hi, shout out again to my honors A period kids, right? Shout out all the kids that have been doing so well on their artwork presentations and stuff like that. But let's keep this flip rocking and rolling, right? Let's keep rocking and rolling. And we were talking about Johann Tetzel, Pope Leo X, nepotism, Medici Pope, indulgences, stuff like that. And we also discussed how when a penny in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, right? And Johann Tetzel and his campaign of selling Bugatti, Ferrari-level indulgences that would not only get you out of purgatory, but a family member out of purgatory, are going to anger and enrage and destroy the hope of fixing so many things set forward by this one man, a German monk by the name of Martin Luther, right? So really, really big thing about it, though, is we're now getting into the story of Martin Luther and his Reformation, right? We're now talking about Martin Luther, the growth and expanse of his ideas, right? Now, Martin Luther, that young German priest who spoke out against the Catholic Church and no one listened and stuff like that, has a very, very long and in-depth backstory. It's not just that he walked up one day, had 95 problems with the church and freaked out, right? No, it's not like that at all. What actually ended up happening is, first and foremost, Martin Luther, the young German-speaking man that he is, first thing you need to know is that he does not live in Germany, okay? Germany doesn't exist yet, okay? So do me a favor real quick. Just write this down somewhere. Martin Luther lives in what is known at this time as the Holy Roman Empire, right? He lives inside of the Holy Roman Empire, that big area that was founded by Charlemagne and stuff like that, going all the way back to the Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire, the HRE, the Haley Ruther's monogram pencil case, right? So the big thing about it, though, getting into it, is Martin Luther, that young German priest who speaks German, so I know it's confusing saying German, but he doesn't live in Germany and stuff like that. He actually, in his young life, didn't even want to be a priest. When he was a young guy, he had no desire to be a priest. He was going to go off and become a lawyer, right? Now, the thing about it, though, is he was at a university, and he was running from one building to the other, and he's petrified of thunderstorms. And a thunderstorm had popped up, and lightning was raging, and thunder was clapping, and stuff like that. And he was so scared that he dropped down to his knees. And he was a really pious guy. He dropped down to his knees while he was a student at this university, and he looked up to the heavens and said, Saint Anne, if you save me from this storm, I will become a priest in your church. And then he just didn't die. Now, the interesting little thing about it is he does go off and become a priest, and this kind of shows us some little things about Martin Luther, right? Martin Luther's a little, eccentric, I guess the word you could say. He's a little strange. I know in Mr. Mathern's class he talked about how later in his life, when he was much older, he, killed an insect and became afraid of hell. Martin Luther's not, a great person in history, okay? I really do feel like to take a chance right now, you always got to talk about why you don't want to idolize people in history, because they're not all perfect, okay? Because, for example, Martin Luther may have started the Reformation, but the big thing he was was also anti-Semitic. He, did not like people of the Jewish faith, which is disgusting and intolerant, and we should not accept that if and or ever. All right, so now. So the thing about it is we should just never accept things like anti-Semitism, and he was very anti-Semitic. Actually, one of his books that he wrote was called The Jewish Problem. That was one of the one books that the disgusting man himself, Hitler, saved and didn't burn in rallies and stuff like that. But really quickly then why are we talking about this priest who took the 95 Theses and nailed it to the door of this church, and he never actually even did that in the first place? Why are we talking about him then? It's because he is going to be the guy that this event, when he writes this stuff, the big thing about it is the ideas stick finally. Why didn't Jan Hus's ideas stick? Why didn't John Wycliffe's ideas stick? Why didn't all the things that John Wycliffe, Jan Hus, and Darius Erasmus had been saying that were in the 95 Theses as well, not hit with the same reverberation that Martin Luther's did? Well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it can be spread much easier, right? So really quickly, before we go any further, let's talk about the 95 Theses itself, right? The 95 Theses is a document that was written by Luther that had 95 different issues in it with the church, right? It disapproved of indulgences, it criticized the power of the popes, and also another big thing about it you should definitely highlight real quick is that it was a call to debate and to fix these things. It was never a call to start a brand new church. Martin Luther had intended to stay Catholic, right? He intended to stay in the Catholic Church and stay and remain a priest. But things that are going to transpire are going to kind of show that that's not going to happen, right? And also, we think that the 95 Theses was never nailed to the door of a church. We think it was just a letter. We think it was a letter to an archbishop in his area that he was writing to try and encourage a debate with the Pope or trying to get some kind of conversation going. Because really quickly, Martin Luther wasn't your normal kind of German priest, right? He was actually a professor at a very, very large university. I believe it's Wittenberg, at the Wittenberg University. And like, the big thing about it, though, is if any of y'all have ever been onto a college campus before, right? They have these bulletin boards everywhere where they announce things, where they'll be like, oh, rush this fraternity, or, oh, there's an event on campus next week, or whatever. So in the Renaissance period during the 1500s, you would do this at universities by posting things on the church door, right? You would actually use the church door much like a bulletin. And so literally that's why the image of him nailing it to the door became such a popular idea, right? Because he was actually a professor and stuff like that. But the big thing about it, though, in general, is what's going to end up happening is the printing press is going to be the reason why Martin Luther is still talked about today, why he's so important, why everybody believes that it's just such a big deal to talk about. And remember, we don't like Martin Luther the man, but the event that he caused is going to cause a cataclysmic series of events and cause and effects throughout the rest of Europe, right? So the big thing that's going to end up happening is that there's going to be a massive debate. What's going to happen is the impact of the printing press is going to really, really take over. Martin Luther is going to have his 95 Theses copied and copied on the printing press, and multiple different copies of it are going to span all over Europe. Well, some of these copies of the 95 Theses are going to end up in the hands of the Pope. The Pope at the time, Leo X, is going to call Martin Luther to Rome, and he says, you need to stop printing these 95 Theses, stop spreading them all over Europe, stop doing these different things, or else we're going to have some issues. So come down here and talk to me and debate me, or else. Now, all of this was written in a letter that the Pope had sent him. Now, what Martin Luther had heard is that at this meeting where the Pope was writing this letter to him, he had all those copies of Martin Luther's 95 Theses, and then he burned them at the Vatican, right? Well, Martin Luther, in response to this, is going to take that letter that called him down to Rome, and in front of all these German princes, he's going to burn it and say, death to the court of Rome. And he just drops the letter from the Pope in a large fire, which grows his reputation even further, showing that he does not care that the Pope is doing. And also, is it very, very relevant and very, very important to understand that Martin Luther is probably going to be aware of what happened to Jan Hus and all these other reformers that came before him? Yes, of course he is. So he doesn't feel safe going to Rome, right? Well, another big thing about it as well that you need to understand is after he burns that letter, a pamphlet war is going to ensue. What the heck do you think a pamphlet war is? Well, a pamphlet war is literally when Martin Luther began writing pamphlets about the church, and then the church began writing pamphlets about Martin Luther, and this war kind of ensued and stuff like that, right? But as the years progressed, and as Martin Luther refused to go meet with the Pope, and refused to give in, and refused to actually do any of these different things, he's going to be excommunicated. And so Martin Luther's going to be excommunicated at the end of 1520, right around December 1520, January 1521. Now, when this all goes down, there's going to be a huge meeting that Charles V has, okay? Charles V is a very important figure. He is the Holy Roman Emperor. He's very, very young, and he calls a meeting known as a diet. Now, a diet of worms sounds like you're eating worms, but it's not that. The diet of Worms is actually the diet. A diet is a meeting. It's like a conference, all right? And Worms is a city in Germany, right? So he's saying the meeting in Worms, right? So the thing about it, though, in general, Luther is called before Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, after he's been excommunicated by the Pope, after that pamphlet war, after he's burned the Pope's letter, after the Pope has burned his 95 Thesis copies and all this other stuff, right? And he's gaining a big following. German princes are beginning to listen to him a lot. German princes are beginning to volley for him and ask it, and help him and stuff like that, right? Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, to try and prevent war and violence, calls Martin Luther in front of him and says, you need to take all this stuff back. You need to stop your preaching and you need to chill out. And Luther, at that meeting, is going to refuse, right? He's going to refuse and say, by good conscience, I cannot, or by good conscience or without citing scripture, I cannot do the things you're asking me to do, right? And so he refuses to do it, and after that meeting, he will be declared an outlaw. All of his writings are condemned, and since he's now excommunicated, since he's still preaching, and since he's on the run, this entire thing unintentionally started the faith known as Lutheranism, right? But we'll talk more about that when I see y'all in class. Y'all have a good one.